It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Steve Glaveski, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Time Rich, Do Your Best Work, Live Your Best Life. Steve, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Shaun, it is my absolute pleasure to be here.
Well, Steve, this is the first time you and I are meeting, and I know you're going to be brand new to much of my audience. So let's kick off our conversation by having you share a bit of the Steve Glaveski origin story. For all of us meeting you for the first time today, what do we absolutely need to know about you?
Sure. So, the Steve Glaveski origin story, like most of us, I grew up conforming to society's expectations of what success looks like. And so that manifested in my going to university, getting the degree, getting the corporate job, climbing the corporate ladder, getting to a point where I had the six-figure salary, the business class flights, the corporate junkets, all that supposedly happy, healthy, shiny stuff. But I found myself comfortably miserable. And that forced me at the age of 30 to basically ask the question, what do I really want to do with my life? And as a result of that, I pursued entrepreneurship, and I've been pursuing that path now for about 7 years. And that's led me to found several companies, Collective Campus, which is a corporate innovation and startup accelerator, Lemonade Stand, which is a children's entrepreneurship program, and No Filter, which is a media outlet. But it's also forced me or given me the freedom to think about deeper questions when it comes to how we live our lives, how we go about work. And that's basically been the topic of a lot of my articles for Harvard Business Review, as well as my two most recent books, Employee to Entrepreneur, as well as Time Rich, which you alluded to in the intro. So that's a quick 2,000-foot view of who Steve Glaveski is.
Well, I always feel like having that time inside the corporate bubble before you go into entrepreneurship is always super helpful in terms of being able to contrast and compare and understanding what life was like when you reach that pinnacle of success. I feel like when you achieve so many of the things you thought you might achieve in your 40s, like when you're in your 20s and in your 30s, and you get to that point,
Mm.
you're like, this is kind of miserable. I mean, I reached the end of my rope in my software days, so to speak, where I'd achieved everything I wanted career wise. And I was like, and this is terrible. I don't sleep. It's, and so, uh, in terms of that epiphany moment where you decided to jump into entrepreneurship,
hmm
I'm curious what that looked like for you. Like what was the catalyst or the last straw or the thing that made you go, this is time to shift?
Yeah, great question. I think I mean I moved from a large management consultancy that had a pretty play hard, work hard culture, open plan office, and I moved from there into an investment bank where it was very, let's just say, sterile. The office layout was very sterile. You had one desk, you'd be at that desk every day, but more so than the actual logistics of the place, I would constantly be identifying what I thought at least were better ways of doing things. And I'd pitch these better ways of doing things to the powers that be. And the all encompassing response more often than not was, that's great. We love that you're coming up with ideas, but stay in your lane, focus on what's in your position description, and that's it. And for me, as someone who has always been curious, has always been somewhat creative, I mean, I played in a heavy metal band as a 13-year-old and wore makeup and all that fun stuff. So I always had a bit of a wild streak. For me, that just didn't really jive. And I couldn't see myself staying in an organization where I just had to be playing a very narrowly defined role and just being that cog in the machine. That coalesced with my building a prototype for an Airbnb for office space as it was at the time called Hot Desk. Spent about $2,000 building this prototype because I had observed so much vacant office space in my time in the corporate world. And off the back of this $2,000 prototype, I put together a press release, sent it to about 100 journalists whose emails I found from their Twitter profiles. And of course, 99 of them completely ignored me. But one of them got back to me. It happened to be a journalist from the Australian, which is basically, I suppose, our equivalent of maybe the New York Times, if you could call it that. And that article blew up. It got the attention of several investors who reached out to me. And then I secured some seed funding while I was still working at this large investment bank. And so, one, being comfortably miserable, and two, securing some early stage funding gave me the confidence to jump out. And fortunately, since then, I haven't looked back. And it's also opened my eyes to just how much power you do have once you're on the outside to make decisions, and once you realize that you have the capability to find ways to monetize things, to find ways to solve problems, you realize that, hey, even if my current business should reach the end of its rope, I'll be able to come up with something else. And that's just a really liberating, empowering place to be.
I think in terms of staff or employees asking hard questions or challenging us sometimes as leaders, how well that's received, that varies greatly by the culture we're a part of. I
Hmm.
think back to my corporate experiences, 10, 15 years ago, to my most recent management experience where I had several millennials and several Gen Z employees who asked me all kinds of questions and had all kinds of ideas for change and making things better. I feel like there's more of almost like I feel like young people, they want to change the world. They don't know any better, so they just ask. And
Hmm.
I learned quickly with my most recent team that the more I was open to their ideas and changing things when it made sense, we made a lot of really interesting things happen. But if I think of the environments I was a part of a lot earlier in my journey, we would have just told people to be quiet. We don't ask questions. We don't do those sorts of things. So the collaborative nature of what it looks like sometimes in the bubble seems to be a little bit different than what it was, at least when I was starting out back in the day. So, yes, leaders, be open to at least hearing what your people have to say.
Hmm.
People with great ideas and questions know sometimes you might be asking for things that could take 5 years, 10 years to change, depending on the culture you're a part of. But good ideas should at least be heard and given a chance to be voiced. Well, let's transition now into a bit of the story behind the book. As a book guy, I'm always curious to hear how a writing journey, a writing contract gets started. So, in terms of time rich, what was the kind of catalyst that started pushing the boulder down the hill, if you will, for the
Hmm.
writing process?
Sure. So, I mean, several years into my entrepreneurial journey, I was heading up Collective Campus. We had a team of about a dozen people at the time. But I still found that I was anchoring to the past in some ways in terms of our office culture. I felt that I needed to signal hard work by getting into the office at 8 in the morning and staying until 7 in the evening, even if I was pretty much done by 2 p.m. Now, after perpetuating that type of lifestyle or work style for a couple of years, I found that I was not happy. I'd be getting home late. It would be dark. I wouldn't be able to go for a surf. I wouldn't be able to make social meetings with friends and family. And I just questioned whether or not there was a better way to do this. And having read numerous books and having followed the work of people like Adam Grant, who was really pushing this 6 hour workday, we decided to experiment. And so we set up a 2 week experiment, 6 hour workday, and we were basically testing to determine whether or not our productivity would drop off a cliff and whether or not our emotional well being would improve. And that 6 hour workday basically acted as a forcing function. When you have less time, you commit to less pointless meetings. You figure out ways to automate and outsource a lot of the rudimentary tasks. And you get a lot more intentional about getting into that flow state where you're just deeply immersed in one task and the rest of the world seems to fade away. And when you do that, you find that you actually get, in some cases, more done than what you were doing in a 12-hour workday. And you walk away feeling more fulfilled because you're focusing on high value activities. And when you spend time in the flow state, your brain actually releases a flood of neurochemicals, dopamine, serotonin, and the like that make you feel better come the end of the day. So we ran this experiment. Everybody was as productive, if not more productive than before. And we all felt better. I mean, one of my colleagues had a 2-month-old at the time. He got to spend more time with her playing daddy, which was awesome. And so I reflected on this experience and wrote an article for Harvard Business Review called "The Case for the 6 Hour Workday." And that article blew up. I mean, it was syndicated by the likes of the Wall Street Journal and numerous others. And that was essentially the main catalyst for the book Time Rich, because I already had a relationship with Wiley, John Wiley and Sons. I published a previous book for them called Employee to Entrepreneur. So I approached them. I said, "Hey, I wrote this article. It's blown up. It seems to be a topic that's of interest because these things do come in cycles. But I feel like sometimes we read the books, but we don't do anything about them." And they were on board, and that's essentially how Time Reach came about. And it was supposed to come out in May of this year, but thanks to our good friend coronavirus, it didn't come out until October. Thinking that the world would have resumed or reverted back to some semblance of normality, but clearly that has not been the case. But that's basically the origin story of the book.
Well, and one of the things you take us into early on in the book is where our idea of an 8 hour workday came from. Kind of the
Mhm.
what are the norms of our kind of business work life culture. Um, Talk to us a little bit about how I guess some of the origin of that, but also how some of that really is a mismatch for where we are today. The world has changed significantly.
Totally, Sean. So the 8-hour workday, I mean, harkens back to around the 1850s during the Industrial Revolution when a textile manufacturer in the UK by the name of Robert Owen started lobbying for this thing called the 8-hour workday. And their slogan was 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, 8 hours play. And now that's because at the time there was no things such as occupational health and safety. There wasn't really much by way of insurance. I mean, you had 10-year-olds working 12-hour days in coal mines, getting limbs torn off, and basically not receiving much by way of compensation, and also not being paid all that much, a couple of shillings a week, which is the equivalent of several dollars. And so the workers united to start putting the wheels in motion to change this. Now, of course, or maybe not, of course, for some of your listeners who may not be aware, it took about 80 years for that 8-hour workday to become ratified in law, in the United States at least, under the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1937. Now, if you think about work back then, standing by an assembly line, a conveyor belt, in a coal mine, uh, on a farm, you could draw a straight line between hours worked and output. It was quite linear. But since 1937, when that law was enacted, the nature of work has changed so much. It's required a lot more. Its task scope has become a lot greater. It's a lot more cognitively complex. So we've moved from algorithmic work, putting widgets into boxes, to cognitive work. And cognitive work, you can't make that same, you can't draw that straight line from hours to output. In fact, it's more like a inverted U or a bell curve, whereby if you actually cultivate the ability to get into the flow state, to do that deep work on something that requires the application of cognition, you can spend about 4 hours a day in that state, providing you're not distracted all day long, checking your phone and checking your email and all the rest of it. And after that 4 hours, we basically hit the point of diminishing returns. It's a little bit like uh, Forrest Gump in playing American football. So he gets the ball. He's running the wrong way initially. His coach is telling him, "Hey, man, run the other way, run the other way." And he turns around. He starts running. He's like a lightning bolt. He gets to the end zone and he just keeps on running. He runs straight into the change rooms. I think he takes out one of the members of the marching band on his way there. And that's kind of like us. Like, we might do our best work. We might put together that sales presentation. We might write that 2,500 word article, but we'll continue to sit at our desks, tweaking things and working on things way beyond that point of diminishing returns, rather than stopping and moving on to something else. So that 8-hour workday, it made sense in the time when hours were conflated with output, when presence was conflated with productivity, but not so much today when most of us are working with our brains as opposed to just our hands.
Well, and one last thing I want to have you cover before we get more into the process of learning to be in a state of more time richness, if you will, is some of the biggest like time sucks and productivity killers in the workplace. And obviously that varies based on the type of organization you're a part of. But I guess one I'd love for you to talk about a bit is just the tyranny of meetings. You know, I remember in
Mhm.
my software company days, I would sometimes have 6 or 7 hours of meetings a day, and then outside of that, I'd have to actually try to get my job done. So maybe meetings and really expensive meetings might be a place to go with that.
Yeah, really expensive meetings. So typically, if an organization hosts a meeting and there's 8 people around the table, it's a 1 hour meeting. You know, that's not a 1 hour meeting. That's an 8 hour meeting in terms of the expense to that organization. And many of these people may be on six-figure salaries. So you work out the maths, and that's a very expensive meeting very quickly. Another expensive meeting is traveling for a 1 hour meeting because you supposedly have to meet someone face to face. Now, in this time of COVID-19, people are normalizing and coming to terms with the fact that you can actually meet someone through Zoom and it can have the same outcome and save you a lot of time. But if I need to travel, say, from Melbourne to Sydney, that's a 1 hour flight, but it's about an 8 hour investment in terms of my time getting there and back, sitting at the airport and all the rest of it. Time when I really can't do the same quality work that I do elsewhere. Now, the thing about meetings, it kind of reminds me of a quote by one of my favorite philosophers, Seneca, Roman philosopher and statesman, who said that people are frugal when it comes to guarding their property, their money, but not so their time, which is the one thing that it is right to be protective of, because time, unlike money, once you spend it, you cannot get it back. And so, whether it's meetings or whether it's just committing to anything, like we have this tendency to just say yes to all sorts of requests on our time. And in the corporate world, in the business world, if someone sends you a calendar invite, it's typically for 60 minutes. And typically, in a lot of organizations, you're expected to attend. It's not normal for It's not encouraged for you to decline a meeting invite. However, more progressive organizations are moving away from the face-to-face meeting towards asynchronous communication, where rather than having a meeting for everything, if you're just communicating information, that could be done through Slack, through email. We don't need that face-to-face meeting. And if they are meeting at these more progressive organizations, it's up to the person calling that meeting to sell it to the person who is required to attend. One such example I can think of is at the software company Atlassian, where their chief, what's his name, future work, resident work futurist, his title is, he was basically just inundated, like yourself, 6 to 7 hours of meetings a day, every day of the week. And after a while, he asked himself, well, I wonder what happens if I say no to these meetings. Is the world going to end? And it turned out that for every 3 meetings he said no to, only one came back saying, "Hey man, we really need you at this meeting," and two never bothered him again. So it turned out that only one of the three was a boomerang, so to speak. It came back, and two was sticks. And then as a result of doing that, he freed up about 15 hours a week that he could spend on more important work. So I think it's just about being intentional about, one, do we need this meeting? Two, who needs to be here? Do we need 8 people, or is three sufficient? Are we just, participating in some perversion or perverted form of outsourcing accountability because we don't want to take ownership by inviting absolutely everyone and their dog? Uh, and I'm not sure if I said how long the meeting needs to go for, but that's basically it. So who needs to be there? Do we need a meeting? And three, how long does the meeting need to be? Because typically 15 minutes to 30 minutes in most cases is sufficient. So just by being more intentional about how you go about setting your meetings and what meetings you agree to attend, you can find yourself with an extra 10 or 15 hours a week on your plate.
Well, and I was going to actually ask the question I'm going to ask now at the end of the interview, but I think it fits for where we just went in the conversation.
Hmm.
I've really been wrestling with in terms of 2020. While it's been an awful year in terms of coronavirus and death and all, it's just we could make a list of all the bad things of 2020. Yet at the same time, I'm really excited about all the pattern disruptions that we've been forced to think of. How do we do work differently? How do we do meetings differently? How do we
Hmm.
accomplish things differently? So I'd love to have you speak briefly to in terms of, you know, going through a framework like yours to introduce positive change into our own lives and an organization. Has 2020 maybe been kind of a gift in disguise in some ways?
I think it has. I think anytime you go through something difficult, be it a global event like coronavirus or a difficult event in your own life, there are usually many learnings and a lot of character development that comes out of that, and reflection and so on. So I think, one, the fact that typically large organizations who have a lot of cultural inertia have opened their arms and their minds to things like remote work, I think is definitely a positive. Now, what we're starting to see is that many of those organizations are moving their people back into the office in certain parts of the world where cases have stabilized for at least 3 days a week. So I feel like that's probably testament to asking the wrong question. They're probably asking, how many days a week should we send people back to the office for, versus how many days a year will our organization and our people benefit from being face to face? And I think the latter number is a lot lower than the former number. Um, but not only that, I think with the move to remote work, it's forced leaders to open up to different tools, but also uh, asynchronous communication, which I briefly touched on earlier. I mean, in many organizations up until now, typically we are built on these cultures of hyper responsiveness. If I receive an email, I'm responding to that email within an hour. If I receive a Slack or a Microsoft Teams message, I see the red dot, I'm jumping in, I'm responding straight away. Someone's tapping me on the shoulder, I'm dropping everything I'm working on. Hey, what's up? What can I help you with? And that might seem like we are making ourselves available and we're putting the mission of the organization first and foremost, but those are just very shallow forms of signaling that ultimately leave us in a state where we are distracted all day long and we're never cultivating that ability to focus on one thing for extended periods of time. And the problem with that is that when we do get into flow, McKinsey ran a study on this where they found that when we're in that flow state, we're up to 5 times more productive than when we're not. However, when we do get interrupted, it can take us on average about 20 or so minutes to get back into the zone. But if I am interrupted every 6 minutes, I mean, the typical executives checks email 72 times a day, spends about 4 hours a day staring at their smartphone, receives 46 notifications, be it on their desktop or their smartphone per day. We are distracted all day long. And as a result of that, we're never really cultivating that ability to get into flow and do our best work. And this is also why people might find themselves at the end of the day feeling absolutely exhausted, but not having all that much to show for it. And it's also part of the reason why 85% of people globally, according to Gallup, are either not engaged or actively disengaged at work, which means just 15%, or what's that, 1 in 7 of us are actually engaged by our work, which is, nothing short of tragic when I think about all of that untapped human potential out there.
Yeah, I think when we're stuck in that state of reacting all the time, we're always playing defense and never offense. So we're we're never actually able to score points a lot of the day. We're always
Mhm.
reacting to whatever. I always say the tyranny of the urgent, or the fire that gets dropped on your desk. That's kind of what you're
Indeed.
stuck dealing with. Next, I'd love to have you dwell on some of the ground you cover in chapter 11 for a couple minutes. I felt like that's the pivotal chapter. If you can grasp some of that content, then you're ready to hear what you have to say in terms of the process. So, we'd love to have you talk to us a little bit about prioritizing, um, economies of scale, alignment, and the 80-20 rule. I felt like if people don't get a grasp of some of that ground you cover in chapter 11, they're not going to be ready for what comes after that.
Totally. So in chapter 11, I provide people with a framework to get more done in less time, which is easy to remember. I use a visual mnemonic called P coats. So think of the winter jacket, the P standing for prioritization. Now, nothing new, but most people don't effectively practice it. So the thing about prioritization is, if you look at universal laws of nature like the Pareto principle, 20% of inputs are responsible for 80% of outputs. Now, this shows up on our roads. 20% of the roads is where you'll find 80% of the cars. It shows up in many businesses, whereby 20% of your customers generate 80% of the revenue. And you can apply this rule to your tasks, your marketing channels, sales techniques, and so on. There's going to be certain things that outperform everything else. And the same applies to your task list. You sit down to your work, you might have 10 things on your task list, and generally, 2 or 3 of those tasks will be a lot more valuable than the others. Now, you want to find a simple way to prioritize those. For me, it's just rating all of those tasks out of 10 for value, and then C for cost. How long is it going to take me to do this? Divide value by cost, and I come up with a number, and I prioritize by the highest number. Um, C in P coats is cut. Eliminate all of the stuff that you've been doing just because you've always been doing it. But upon reflection, it doesn't really add much value. So every quarter with my team and on an individual basis, I will draw a quadrant up on a whiteboard with do more, do less, start doing, stop doing in each corner. And then just reflect upon marketing channels, sales techniques, customer segments, products we're selling, tasks we're engaging in, and just map that out. And by doing that, on a regular basis, you find that over time you end up focusing on, you're really sharp in terms of what you spend your time on, and you're not spending time on stuff that you've been doing for 5 years just because you've always been doing it. O in P codes is outsource. Nowadays, rudimentary tasks, step-by-step process-oriented tasks, you can find someone to do that for you for typically $10 an hour. There's platforms out there, Freelancer, Upwork, you name it, that uh, you should be looking into, because ultimately you've got to reflect on what you consider your hourly rate to be. If your hourly rate is, say, $100 an hour, but you find yourself doing work that people will do for you for $10 an hour, then you're effectively costing yourself $90 an hour every time you do that, because you should be focusing on higher value work, strategic thinking, sales, doing whatever your strength is where you can really move the needle, rather than sitting in the back of some content management system trying to figure out the HTML, even though that's something that you completely suck at. Moving on from that, A for automate. Typically, you want to automate before you outsource, but it didn't fit into the mnemonic. So A for automate. I've got a PDF at timereachbook.com, which people can download, which has a whole bunch of automation tools across customer service, sales, marketing, administrative, HR, finance that can automate day-to-day tasks as well as those bigger, say, monthly, quarterly reporting tasks. For example, there's a tool in there that will take a Facebook Live video and automatically turn that into, say, an audiogram, a YouTube video, a podcast episode, a transcribed blog post, and social media posts. Now, you can either automate that or you can do it yourself, and it's going to take you 7 hours. If you automate it, it's going to take you a click of a button. So that's effectively the difference when you start thinking about the world through that automation lens. T for test your assumptions. If I think about the two biggest ways people waste their time, it's jumping to conclusions and spending all their time and money on the wrong thing, or it's pontificating forever in this perpetual state of analysis paralysis. Now, you can get out of both of those time wasting states simply by testing your assumptions. If I'm, to take an example that everybody would be familiar with, if I'm the founders of Uber back in 2007, I could jump to conclusions, build the app, onboard hundreds of drivers, spend a ton of money on above the line marketing, or I could test my assumption, which is that people will jump into a car with a stranger to get home. Now, I could go out to a busy taxi rank on a Saturday night and just ask people if they would pay $20 to jump into a car with a stranger to get home, show them some idea so there is some semblance of risk mitigation on their part, and see how many people say yes. Now, that's something that I can test. 30 minutes, I'm out there, I speak to a number of people, I get a gauge for whether or not this is something that I should be thinking a little bit more about or something that I should just drop. And then finally, S for start your engines. Like, what are those things that get you going? What are those things that get you into flow? It could be exercise. It could be a 20-minute walk outside in nature. It could be setting your workstation up in a place where you're not going to be interrupted. It could be echoing Isaac Newton's first law of motion, which is that an object in motion stays in motion, and overcoming procrastination as a result. So, for example, if I sit down to work in the morning, my innate biological biases want me to conserve energy because that helped us survive on the African savannah. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into Twitter, I'm going to check my email, I'm going to try and get to inbox zero, I'm going to go into LinkedIn, check my mentions, all easy stuff that doesn't really help us move the needle on anything. But if I start my engine by just committing to the smallest possible work unit on that difficult task, so if I'm writing a 1,000 word article, let's commit to 100 words. And once that object is in motion, it's so much easier to keep going. And the last thing I wanted to say about this, which was economies of scale, you briefly touched on that in the question there. If you have certain, say, assets or domain expertise or strengths you've developed, you can work on multiple things by doubling down on that. So, for example, you look at people like, say, Joe Rogan. Now, to the external observer, he may seem to be someone who just does so many different things. How does he do so many different things? But there is this alignment. For example, he's a comedian, which means he has honed the craft of communication. He understands audiences, and he's translated or transferred that skill set into his podcast, incidentally, one of the most popular podcasts in the world. And he's also transferred that skill set into being a UFC commentator. Voice, language, communication, that is his craft. And just so happens that he is a black belt in jiu-jitsu, so he can provide that extra level of insight when it comes to that UFC commentary. So I think when you think about the world that way, you realize that there's a hell of a lot more that you can do just by doubling down on those innate strengths and those assets that you've developed to get more done across myriad areas or just get more done across one.
Another thing I wanted to have you comment on was health, because I think we can get tools, we can automate, we can make all sorts of changes, but if our health is garbage, it doesn't matter how much we try to change. We're not going to have the energy to keep moving forward.
Oh, totally. I think there is, for example, in many a corporate office, you'll see people eating lunch at their desks. Like they'll literally be glued to that chair for hours on end. But to perform at a high level cognitively, you need to take breaks. For example, 20-minute walk outside in nature, has been shown to release a brain-derived nootropic factor, or BDNF. Now, that's because your body senses that moment as a fight or flight moment, going back to our evolutionary wiring. And as a result, it releases this chemical which forces us to be more focused, because that would have helped us, again, to survive on the savannah. Now, when you go for that 20-minute walk after eating lunch at your desk and trying to power through, you actually find you come back to your desk and you're refreshed. You can actually perform at a much higher level. But I mean, none of this stuff in terms of health that I'm going to touch on now is not revolutionary. I mean, ultimately, getting that 8 hours sleep a night, or at least seven, because people oftentimes don't realize this, but with sleep, you've got your deep sleep, your REM sleep, and your non-rapid eye movement sleep, NREM. Now, with that deep sleep, that is fundamental when it comes to emotional regulation and creativity. Two things that are, key to living good lives and doing great work. But about 75% of that deep sleep comes between the sixth and eighth hour of an 8 hour sleep cycle. But so many people aren't getting them. So many people are getting maybe 5 to 6 and saying, I'm good with that. But the thing about being sleep deprived is, if you've been that way for years, you don't know you're sleep deprived. That's just your natural mode of being. So whatever you can do to try and get that extra hour or two of sleep, it's going to work wonders in terms of how irritable you are, how much clarity you have, and also how creative you are. When it comes to that associational thinking, connecting dots between different things, coming up with new ideas, a lot of that is forged in that latter end of a sleep cycle. Um, Now, fortunately, there are things you can do to get a better night's rest. If you're staring at your smartphone just before bed, stop doing that. Or at least put some blue blockers on, and maybe don't watch something or read something that's very stimulating, so you can get a better night's rest. Dimming the lights is another thing you can do. Uh, Having some magnesium tends to calm the body down, and also maybe a hot shower or a hot bath before bed. As the body's cooling itself down, it just becomes so much more relaxed and so much easier to fall asleep. Nutrition is another piece that a lot of people, I think, overlook. And now, nutrition, ultimately, it's different for every person. I'm not going to say this is what you must do. You must do a keto diet. You must do a paleo diet. You must do a vegan diet. I am not about dogmatic thinking like that. But ultimately, uh, what I do find for myself works is, slow release carbohydrates, good clean proteins, and a little bit of good fat. Um, I've touched on evolutionary biases a couple of times, but I tend to fast for about 16 hours a day, and the reason I do that is because the first 3 or 4 hours of my day, I'm in a fasted state, and when you're in a fasted state, your mind starts using ketones for energy, and that forces us to be a lot more focused. Whereas if I wake up and I have a big hearty breakfast to start my day with, my body's trying to digest that. I might feel a bit sluggish afterwards. And instead of being at my best cognitively, I'm actually starting my day on the back foot. Um, so sleep, nutrition, and ultimately exercise. Now that doesn't mean you go out into the gym and you're deadlifting 140 kilos or anything like that. It just means that you're incorporating movement into your day. Going for walks, even just doing some body weight squats, whatever it is. If you're finding yourself sluggish at your desk, just go for a walk around the block and maybe, do 20 push-ups or something like that. Like, that will have a profound impact on how you show up to your work. So there's a couple of things on well-being or physical well-being that you can apply to your work that will have a profound effect.
And in terms of, somebody gets a hold of the book, they start making some shifts and changes. Obviously, you've talked about testing and iterating, but in terms of like large scale evaluating how things are working, or are there more changes to be made? Is that a continuous process or something to like revisit on an annual basis? I'm always curious in terms of a framework. How often do we kind of come back to the drawing board and evaluate where we're at?
Yeah, look, I tend to come back on a quarterly basis. I think if you come back too often, you're probably not giving, the medicine time to heal the patient effectively, or so to speak. So coming back on a quarterly basis, I mean, doing that quadrant activity that I mentioned earlier is one way you can go about doing that. And depending on the size of your organization, you might want to also send out a survey just to see how people are going when it comes to their emotional well-being. How are they finding, whether it's working remotely full time or whether it's working less hours, whatever the case may be? Do they need more support? You'll also want to keep your finger on the trigger in terms of productivity, and the productivity can be can mean different things to different people. It could just mean top line revenue, or EBIT for some organizations. It could mean how many story points, if you use agile, you're getting out the door. Or it could just mean that, look, we're generating enough income to live the lives we want to live. And to take a more philosophical approach, and something Seneca also said was, we a rich man is someone who is content with what they have, and the proper limit to wealth is to have what is necessary and to have what is enough. And I think that's a question, or a statement that perhaps we don't reflect on enough. We wired to want more, 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 to build, build, build. Like you said earlier, Shaun, you said, you worked hard, you got to this point in your career where you had everything that society told you you should go for, and you just weren't happy. Like, it sucked. And so, reflecting on what is enough for you, and then living and working accordingly, you might find that, oh, actually, I've got my business to a point where it is doing enough, and I could double down and hustle and put in the extra 4 hours a day, even though my mind's already fried, to try and get that extra 10% of revenue. Or I could just keep it here and spend more time with my family, with my friends, working on my spiritual practice, learning a new hobby, whatever the case is. So I think that's just an important question, or thing that we need to reflect on a little bit more. Otherwise, if we don't stop and reflect every now and again, like Mark Twain said, we might find ourselves on our deathbeds with many regrets as to how we lived our lives.
Yeah, I imagine most of us on our beds aren't going to be thinking, "Gosh, I sure wish I'd worked a few more hours." One thing I would
Yeah.
say too is just in terms of what's important. That looks different for every person, and so as you're kind of writing your own story and the journey you want to be going on, you can learn from Steve, you can learn from me, you can learn from lots of
Hmm.
people. But you don't have to live Steve's story. You don't have to live my story. You're actually writing your own story, so it's okay if it looks slightly different. How this works out for you is going to look slightly different from another person. So be okay to be blazing your own path, if you will. Almost time
Indeed.
for us to wrap up, Steve, but I want to be sure you get in a plug for your podcast. So if somebody subscribes to your show, what are they going to encounter there?
So Future Squared is basically a show that is all about helping people think in multidisciplinary ways. I think nowadays, there is a lot of polarization out there. There is a lot of black or white thinking that hardens people to certain pre-existing beliefs. And I think that when you encounter thinking across different fields, neuroscience, spirituality, philosophy, psychology, technology, entrepreneurship, politics, economics, you realize that there are a lot of different things that conflict with each other, different ideas that conflict. And after a while, you start to realize that, well, I'm not 100% sure what's right. I have an idea as to what is more right than wrong. And then when you do engage with people in conversation, it just makes you more open, more tolerant, and less dogmatic, I find, when you take that approach. So I've interviewed all sorts of people, be it Adam Grant, Kevin Kelly, Robert Greene, Gretchen Rubin, you name it, people who are top of the field across myriad areas. And, I know for me at least, it's probably had that effect on me, because I remember myself being in my early 30s, pretty cocksure about myself. If somebody criticized an idea that I held, I'd think of that as an attack on me as a person, and I'd get really defensive. Whereas now I'm just so much more open to having ideas I think are true being questioned and criticized, because ultimately what matters is not being right, but learning what is more right, so that I can then navigate the world with a more accurate map, so to speak. And that's essentially what I try to do with the Future Squared podcast.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference between having a bunch of quotes in your head and things that you can, basically regurgitate.
Hmm.
But then there's like knowing, having lived and experienced. Like it's, I feel like there's a shift where really in that 25 to 35 space, we're pretty sure of ourselves. And when we head
Hmm.
into our 40s, we have a little bit more wisdom and experience. I feel like that's where we really develop some interesting things to say in terms of culture. And I find too, having interviewed hundreds of people, I learned something unique from every single guest. Every
Yeah.
conversation, I'm changed because of it, because there's something they drew out of my journey or added to my journey that just wouldn't have been there without that experience. It certainly
Hmm.
stretched me through the years. And Steve, in terms of people connecting with you, find out more about what you do, your books, your podcast, where are some of the places we can hang out with you on the web?
Sure. So steveglaveski.com, Glaveski, is probably, well, is the place that will find links to all my social, my businesses, my podcast, all that good stuff. They'll also find a link there to the Time Reach website where they can download the first chapter of the book for free. And they can also download that PDF I mentioned with all of the automation hacks. And, those hacks will deliver an immediate benefit in terms of time saved. So definitely worth checking out.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places you can connect with Steve and pick up your very own copy of his new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Steve Glaveski. Once again, our book today was Time Rich, Do Your Best Work, Live Your Best Life. Again, if you want to find out more, head on over to Steve's website at steveglaveski.com or go to the book's website at timerichbook.com. And Steve, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thanks for having me.